Hey, Kitty.
Hey, Kittie.
What's up, Kitty? Yo, Kitty.
Talk to him, Kitty.
Hey, baby. Hey, baby.
Welcome to Talk to Me, Kitty. I'm your host, Kittie Rose, and we have an amazing guest with us today. His name is Matt Phifer. He is a therapist, coach, and an author.
First of all, thank you for having me on. Not only is it an honor to be here, but I'm happy to finally meet you in person. I didn't realize we lived right up the street from each other,
Right up the
basically.
street.
So
Well, I'm glad to meet you as well. I've been following you for a while.
yeah, likewise.
Let me go ahead and tell you all now, okay, how I came across Matt Phifer on TikTok. He used to always do the TikTok lives, and he was having educational lives and stuff where he would be teaching. It was one I think I saw you were teaching about boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was boundaries, and it was really good. And I was like, oh yeah. And I'm a nerd, so
Yep.
I love listen to stuff like that.
Yep.
And plus, since I teach classes all the time, I was like, this is definitely refreshing to see, most definitely. But what I will say is that paying attention to your content over time, I've noticed that you talked a lot about psychological abuse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that people don't realize how hidden it is in relationships.
Yep.
We hear a lot of buzzwords, as we talked about, we hear a lot of buzzwords, and people think abuse is just abusive.
Mm-hmm.
They don't understand the emotional and verbal, mental forms of abuse. So I definitely do want to talk about that today. If you could, go ahead and start and just tell us exactly what, from your perspective, what psychological abuse is.
Psychological abuse, obviously, one of those buzzwords, manipulation.
Yep.
And then also you hear a lot of people talking about gaslighting. But here's something that when you talk about psychological abuse that a lot of people don't understand is that doesn't necessarily mean that that they're a narcissist. B, doesn't necessarily mean that the person who is doing it intentionally.
Right.
But also when we talk about psychological abuse, I always try to come up with a picture to paint for people to kind of understand where, you have a person that's kind of playing puppet master, that's using things like the fog method, fear, obligation, and guilt, making you feel fear or inciting like some sort of form of obligation that you have to do something, or making you feel guilty about doing something or not doing something. And ultimately, they have you doing things that are going to benefit them in some way. Now, just because it benefits them doesn't always mean that it's abusive, but when you feel like, or it's somehow detrimental to you, detrimental to your mental health, detrimental, it's crossing over your boundaries, you're the one who it always seems to end up with, no money, always seems to end up, on the streets, things like that. You're the one who ends up, and you're sacrificing literally your last to make sure that it benefits to them, because you feel like that person is going to leave, or that person is going to hurt you, or they're making threats, or they're making you feel guilty, making you feel obligated, just like we were just talking about. Then more than likely there's some sort of psychological abuse that's happening.
And so there are typically people who are more prone to enter relationships with people who are psychologically abusive.
Yep.
For instance, codependent people, very prone to that, or people who operate within their fears. If you have a fear of abandonment, if you have a fear of rejection as well, it can be multiple layers when it comes to fear, but those people are typically susceptible. People who have certain attachments, people who come from trauma as well. They have narcissistic parents or anything like that, parents with mental disorders. They're typically susceptible to entering relationships with them. They're more prone to it. And those type of people, those type of individuals, typically, it's not that they can't see the warning signs. They avoid paying more attention to the warning signs because there is something that they're still receiving from that person. And then most times you don't see the abuse from that person right off. It's very subtle.
Yep.
At first, they come in and they give you all the attention. They give you all of the affection and make you feel good, right? Do all of those things. They want you to be around them and depend on them a little more. And they start to isolate you from like your family and things like that. And you start kind of going through that social, I don't want to necessarily say exclusion, but it's kind of simple. It's kind of like alienation almost.
Isolation.
In a sense. Yeah. So they isolate you from family, friends, things like that. You start relying more on them. Sometimes they can get into your head as well.
Yep.
But what else do you think, so that we can make
A couple
sure
of
that
things that I would say, some things that oftentimes get overlooked is your desire to please, your desire to
Mhm,
make someone else happy, your
mhm,
desire to the only way I can describe it is oftentimes if you were neglected as a child, more like emotionally, and you always had this desire to make someone proud. You were always
yes,
seeking for other people's approval and for,
yes,
so you're an overachiever.
mhm,
And a lot of people who do this, I've met with a lot of people who at work, at school, they're top notch. They're
right,
banging, right?
right,
They're the president of this, the CEO of that.
mhm,
They have, and this functional business. And then at home, they have this chaos,
yeah,
right? They have
mhm,
they're dysfunctional in their relationships, whether it be friends, whether it be their romantic relationships or
mhm,
both. And a lot of times I'll meet with people and they say, I can't figure out why, like, I'm so great in this area, but I'm
mhm,
terrible in this area. And I can't understand why I can't translate the two to where, like, I'm, top notch in all in my life all the way around, where there's just genuine balance.
right,
And a lot of times it comes from that inkling that that you feel like you want people to be proud of you. So you're at work and
mhm,
you're overachieving,
mhm,
hoping that people are going to recognize it at home, that your wife, your husband, your mom, your father are going to recognize it, but they don't. Right. And
right,
sometimes that, going back to psychological abuse, sometimes that's very intentional. They're not
mhm,
giving you the attention and the praise that you might deserve, or that you deserve to be celebrated. And then because they're not, you still feel like you need to overachieve. And if you kind of notice, you might notice that there's a certain person that's pulling these strings, and the things that
mhm,
you're overachieving in are the things that are really, actually, in a very strange way, are really, like, they're the ones that are getting the accolades that you are deserving of.
right,
So they're benefiting from you overachieving as a doctor and as this. They may even brag about you to other people with
mhm,
you not around, but then behind closed doors, oh, so you come home and you're like, oh, I got an A on this test, and I did this, I did that. Yeah, well, you should always do that,
right,
right? You should all, and on the surface, that sounds like it's not that big of a deal, like they just want the
mhm,
best for you. But when I call it death by a thousand cuts. A lot of people
mhm,
call it death by a thousand cuts, where you're never getting the recognition that you deserve.
right,
You're never celebrated. And at some point in time, it gets to a point where, because we all need it, right? We all
mhm,
need that recognition.
mhm,
We all need that validation at some
mhm,
point. And and then what ends up happening is that you are constantly looking for and doing things that are adverse to you,
right.
to benefit them, but they never quite give you that validation that you're looking for, which then, before you know it, they're in complete control, and basically calling the shots all they need to.
And so most times I think, because you hear a lot of people say that it's not coming from childhood, it's not coming from trauma, but it usually is rooted in some type of experience. So if you're a people pleaser, or if you're an overachiever, or if you're a perfectionist, it's rooted somewhere. Maybe you did have a household, and it's not taken away from the fact that you probably had amazing parents who did the best that they could, right?
Mhm.
But then you probably had some parents projected their own failures on you and they wanted you to be successful. Or some parents really just wanted to see you do better in life. And so you received a lot of criticism on, like, grades and what you're doing, academics and things like that. And so it made you feel inadequate, in a sense, like,
Mhm.
I'm incompetent or I'm inadequate. And so you're constantly striving to do better. Maybe you didn't get recognition because you got a C or a D, right?
Right.
And so the only time that you received that recognition or celebration is when you had A's and B's. So you're constantly achieving. So that puts you in that place. Or maybe you had parents who, just say, were like dysregulated a lot. Maybe the ones that I spoke earlier, they had mental disorders or things like that. And maybe you just had perfectionistic parents. It could be a number of things.
Yep.
Maybe you had parents who were going through, like, some type of financial hardships or something like that, and you had to step in, or maybe you had to set aside your needs and prioritize theirs. And
Yep.
so it got to the point to where you weren't vocal, about your needs. And then sometimes, you can pedestalize certain people, things like that, but maybe you weren't able to set boundaries, right? You weren't able to have a voice, things like that. You constantly had to prioritize other people's needs, and you took that later on in life. And then a lot of times just people make mistakes, caregivers and parents, they make mistakes, and in very subtle ways, they can undermine a child's self-worth very, very easily. So you already are questioning your worth, right? In your developmental stages, the way that you react, the way that you respond, your patterns and things like that are rooted in what you've seen and what you experienced in your childhood. And it slowly creeps up into your adult relationships. So since I had to prioritize the needs of maybe my parents or caregivers, now I do this exact same need, and I pedestalize my romantic partners, right? Or I do whatever I can. I put their happiness above my own, and it's not a means of feeling that they're more important. Sometimes it can be because you're feeling unworthy, or sometimes it can be because if you prioritize their happiness, they won't leave you. They'll give you the validation. They'll give you the reassurance and things like that. And those type of people who come into those relationships, before they even get into the relationship, if we pay attention to the profile of an abuser, of a psychological abuser, but we're just going to say an abuser, if we pay attention to the profile of them, they see all of that, right? Like, I see that if I give you attention, you latch on. And then the moment I don't give you attention, you become hypervigilant, or it shows, right? Or maybe I see that if I voice something, or even I don't have to voice it, right? But you want to please me so badly to the point to where you'll sacrifice something of yourself, you'll minimize yourself for the sake of me, that lets me know I have you.
There's a reason why we teach our kids don't take candy from strangers.
Right.
Because what happens is we have to recognize that for manipulation to work, we have to understand that there has to be good times in between.
Yes.
That something has to be offered up front, period. Right? It doesn't work without it. If someone, even the worst, the most detrimental people pleaser in the world, would not fall for manipulation if there weren't good times in between, if there wasn't something offered in the beginning. Right. And so, we teach our kids don't take candy from strangers, because we understand as adults that's the bait before the hook. But as adults, we still struggle with it, because oftentimes someone will, like you said, we have certain ideas of what a certain man or a certain woman should look like and how they should present themselves. Right. And because we struggle with self-worth and we idealize this person, we think that if I can be with this person, that now I have self-worth, that now my worth is now attached to this person. And so then a lot of times the validation that we're looking for, that we're receiving, is actually from external people, right? Now it's coming from social media. Oh, y'all look good together. Y'all are relationship goals. Y'all are this, y'all are that. Y'all, y'all should get married. You need to lock that down because it's the ideal situation. Right. And even though behind closed doors, internally that I don't feel like I'm being treated with respect, or I'm treated well, you'll accept it because of the validation that you're getting from the church, from your family, from other people. And then it's not until oftentimes several years, several months down the road that you start to realize that this isn't, you hear people say, like, on the surface, everything looked great, but behind closed doors, it was a completely different situation, because you were looking for that validation. But what happens is that when we have that person on a pedestal, we actually have them, like, we are thinking of them as perfect. And we think that if a lot of times that's because of our own internal trust issues, that if I can't find the perfect person, that I can't, if this person is less than perfect, then there's a chance that I'm going to get hurt through this process. And then you don't realize till later on that this person, just like everybody else, has their flaws. It doesn't matter how much you idealize them. It doesn't matter how high on a pedestal. And then, but when you start to see the cracks in their armor, that's when it's like, you're like, whoa. Right. And if they're not perfect, then guess what? That means that I'm not perfect either. Because just like I was just talking about, their worth is attached to mine.
And that's why I feel like more people need to teach the different stages, just in relationships in general. we romanticize things very early on, right? We romanticize things. And then, of course, like you said, we have these idealized expectations and we create this perfect idea of somebody. We're living in this fantasy world. And sometimes it can take months or it can take years for a person to meet that stage of disillusionment to where they finally realize that this person is not as perfect as I believed they were. And now I'm realizing that me trying so hard to maintain this relationship has been at the expense of my well-being, of my mental well-being, of my emotional well-being. And that's when they finally get to the realization that I'm actually unhappy. This illusion is gone. I'm unhappy. This is not good for me. But then you see that some people, they don't leave. You know, they realize that they've had time. Now they have children, they have assets and things together. Or maybe their self-worth has become dependent on this person, right? Or maybe there are certain things that are in a state of reinforcement to where if they do certain things, it's going to reinforce certain beliefs or certain fears that they're trying to run away from as well. And so they stay, sometimes to the point to where they're just miserable, right?
Well, one of the things I teach people a lot about the stages of dating, and people are shocked when because I hear people say slow down. A lot of times people just say that just to say that, but I tell them, like, one of the things I'm really big about is not just saying stuff to like just say it, but I give people like actual research behind it. And people don't realize that how long it really actually takes to get to know somebody. You know, you have people that are moving in together after like 3 months and, you know, loving each other and having kids after 6 months because they idealize that person. And then when, you know, you or I work with them and then they realize that it takes a year to really actually get to know someone. And then even after that, right? So 6 months to a year, right, is the honeymoon phase. And so you hear all these people saying, oh, this person love bombed me. They didn't love bomb you. You just didn't know them. You genuinely didn't know them. You were going too fast. And then by the, you know, after a year, you had already moved in, already had kids, already this, then you got to know who this person really was. Right. And so then after that, so in about 2 years, that's when you start to, that's when the honeymoon phase starts to wear out. And now we're down to the nitty gritty of this actual real relationship of who this person really is. And people always say, well, I didn't see the red flags in the beginning because you were rushing. Right.
They were there. They were always there.
And if people understood that literally every single person has red flags, people would slow down. And if you don't see any red flags, that is the red flag. You either A, don't know them very well, or B, they're hiding it. Right. So it's one of the two things. So either, you know, so if there's no red flags, you know, you could be idealizing that person. You could, you know, also another red flag is that they could be just telling you the things that you want to hear, or maybe you're telling them the things that they want to hear to keep that person around. But you have to understand that if you're making major commitments, buying cars together, you know, putting names on it, you know, and different loans, and a lot of times those are the things that cause that interdependence, that unhealthy dependence, where you feel like you're obligated to stay because you've done so much together, and you were just premature with a lot of the things, a lot of the decisions that you're making.
I will say that, and I'm glad that you're speaking on this, because I think you'll see that a lot of people, they victimize themselves in situations that they've put themselves in, and they want to point the fingers at other people. You can't continue to point the finger at another person. You're only doing so to relieve yourself of what it is that you actually need to face. Many times people put themselves in those situations because there's something you're trying to feel, right? There's something that you said to yourself when you met this person. I'm going to switch over just quickly. This is why I'm against online dating so much, because it takes away from the real experience that you're supposed to have. When we're teaching concept, right, in dating spaces, if you're getting to know a person online, you're not really taking the time to spend around them and actually get to know them, because we live in a digital age that's very superficial. You can hide behind the digital world. But as you get to spend time with this person and you get to understand their temperament and their character and their attitude and orientation towards the world and people and relationships and situations and things like that, then you can test out if this person is good for you. But if you're online dating all the time, you already have an idea, and this person has probably made themselves to be perfect already. So of course, it just reinforces that idea that this person's already perfect in the world that you have created.
Yep.
But when you're just, outside of online dating, when you take the time to get to know people and you're meeting them and you're in the spaces, not only do you learn about them, but you learn about yourself as well. How do I respond to situations like this? How do I respond to their temper? How do I respond to their attitudes? How do I respond to their behaviors? Those are things that a lot of people need to start highlighting in dating and in relationships. On top of that, there are not enough conversations that are geared towards compatibility.
Nope.
You see a lot of people, they fall in love with people's personality. It's so different from mine. It's different. And it seems fun. Now it's a challenge. It's interesting. And then as you get to know this person, you realize that we're polar opposites.
Yep.
We are not compatible whatsoever. But now you've created something.
Yep.
So how do you get out of it now? You adapt or you leave.
Right.
Most people won't leave because a lot of your identity has become merged, not even to that person. A lot of people's identity is merged to the idea.
And they don't want to be the villain.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to be the villain in other people's story. No one wants to be the bad guy. It's the reason why I'm gonna say the N word. The reason why narcissist has been such a hot topic, over the last couple of years on social media. I know that at one point in time I was talking a lot about it, but the problem with it is that people don't realize that when you talk about, when you're pointing fingers, just like you were talking about, and I'm just like you. I never allowed anyone I worked with to point fingers, even if they were really with a narcissist. I never. You have to understand that relationships are a mirror of who you are. So even if it's true that you were with that person and they were really a narcissist, you have to understand that that says a lot about you. And you have to understand that if you're with someone who is resistant to change, guess what? And you're sitting there and you're saying, this person won't change, this person won't change. There's a really good chance that you also aren't changing. The person who's pointing fingers and they won't go to therapy, they won't do this, they won't do that. Guess who else isn't going to therapy? While you're sitting there complaining, while you're sitting there pointing, and a lot of the reason why people do that is because they are, just like you were talking about before, they are avoiding something themselves. They're avoiding making that difficult decision of, I possibly need to break up with this person. I possibly need to, I see that this is manipulative, or this is, emotionally abusive or whatever, but you're also not doing anything about it, right? You're complaining that they're not doing anything, but you also simultaneously aren't doing anything. And
it's so many layers to that, to what it is that you said, because you said it's basically a reflection of you, right? So let me I'll point out a couple of things here. First thing, as you said, what does it say about you? If you see that this person is not willing to change, or they are reluctant to change, and you are staying with that person, and they are showing you that they're avoiding all ways to focus on themselves, it's not just about them. What about you? Why are you staying here? Minus all other factors. I realize that I'm wanting to grow with a person who is stunted, who is stuck or stagnant in this position. That's the first thing. I'm looking at this person and I am saying that this person needs to go to therapy. They need to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And then you're saying that also you may need to go to therapy and things like that. But the reason why people run from that is because in therapy, you have to do so much introspective work that you're going to have to face who you are. And then if we face who we are, then we may have a negative perception about ourselves that shows up in that therapy, counseling, coaching, anything like that. And then this is going to just resurface and bring up certain beliefs that I already have about myself. I'm already feeling like this person has probably highlighted some flaws that I have, or some imperfections that I have. And if I go sit in front of a therapist, you're going to reinforce that. And now I really have to admit that maybe this person was right. And then I'm probably going to internalize it and say, well, maybe something's wrong with me. Maybe I'm bad. Maybe I am flawed. And then that's going to create internal conflict, which is it's just going to create more conflict in a relationship as well, which is the reason why so many people do run from that. I deal with a large amount of couples, some couples to the point where I've had to tell them, look, you need at least 6 months of individual work before I can see you two again. And certain things will surface in the sessions and things like that they have to work on individually, but they try to run from it. I won't see them because they have to face themselves. You see a lot of people. I actually have had a lot more avoidance in the past 2 years than anything. And when we bring up certain experiences that they've had, or maybe certain things within themselves, it triggers things, right? It triggers whether it's a fear of commitment that they have to acknowledge, whether it's intimacy anxiety that they're facing, whether it's a fear of abandonment, and then it evokes all of these really strong emotions that they have been running from for so long. And in these relationships, that's what happens.
Yep.
Also, when we're talking about abuse, when you're talking to people and you have to let them know, when you belittle this person, when you manipulate this person, when you give the silent treatment, when you guilt trip them, when you call them out of their name, when you're patronizing or condescending, like all of these things can be forms of manipulation. When you're gaslighting this person. And then when you bring up and you highlight those tactics, or sometimes it can just simply be defense mechanisms that they use it. But when you highlight those, they try to run from that.
They don't know any other way.
Mm-hmm.
They don't realize, a lot of times it's just so, and that's what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about that some people are doing it unintentionally, right? That they grew up in a home that was like that. They grew up, this was how they communicated. This was how they were communicated with their parents and that sort of thing. And so they don't really know any other way. Maybe they had 2 other exes, and that's how they communicated, and they didn't even realize that it was a problem. And now, if people are bringing this up, and change is very, very difficult. Now, what people don't realize, if people knew this, what I'm about to say, they would be very quick to change. That's kind of the definition of insecurity, right? Is when you're masking over all this and you're acting like it's not an issue. And people are literally telling you that it's an issue and that it's a problem and that it's causing friction in your relationships, and you're still not willing to do anything. You're trying to mask. It's just not working. And you mask and you think it's confidence. You may have been told at one point in time that it was confidence by people who kind of know you on a surface level, that you're a very confident person. But the true definition of confidence is someone who's confident is someone who's aware of those insecurities, someone who's aware of those shortcomings, and they don't allow for those things to overwhelm them.
Right.
So people who are really confident, know where number one, where their boundaries lie, first of all, but also know I could get a little bit hot-headed, or if there's been times in my past where I may have been more manipulative or more like that, and I need to be aware of this, right? And self-awareness comes in. I need to be aware of this, so then I don't engage in that, because I don't intend to cause harm to people,
right?
And they know how to, maneuver throughout the world, so they, without going into those type of responses, so then they're not causing damage to their relationships. But people are so busy masking because they're trying to protect, oftentimes, that little boy or little girl that they're trying to keep safe, that they may not have been able to keep safe when they were young.
Let's look at the people who end up in these abusive relationships. Let's look at them. The one who's possibly thinking about dating somebody, they see how this person is, things like that. Maybe they're interested in going into a relationship or entering dating spaces. What do they need to know about themselves to maybe protect them from falling victim to abusive relationships?
So it all starts, first of all, it starts out with your own personal boundaries, knowing your own limits, and knowing kind of your pressure points. So if you have, more than likely you've been in a bad or toxic situation before. And one of the things that people fail to do, and you see this all over social media, and we talked about it today, where people are so busy pointing fingers at that toxic person. Well, part of the reason why you and I advocate and tell people that they need to learn from their toxic relationships and not point fingers is that if you can't piece together how you got into that situation, and why you stayed so long, what were some of the reasons, and if you can't have some self-understanding, then you could be doomed to duplicate or enter another relationship that's very, very similar to that. And so it's not until you're able to put those puzzle pieces back together, and you're able to see that full picture, like, oh, I'm more susceptible to this type of person because of my childhood, or I'm more susceptible to people who are highly demanding. I'm more susceptible to people who are guilt tripping. I'm more susceptible, and I need to be aware of this and that. So I'm going to give you an example. People who I work with, one of the things that we do is we kind of identify like where they feel certain emotions in their body.
Okay.
Right. And not only where they feel it in their body, but you start thinking back about, well, who was I around that made me feel like this? Right. So let's say that they're on a date and they left a toxic relationship. They did some work and that sort of thing. And so they go on a date. Maybe they're dating this person for a month and kind of start to see some red flags come up.
Right.
And, they start to identify, well, when I'm around this person and when we have conflict, I feel like this. Well, where else did you feel like this before? Well, I remember feeling like this with my ex-husband or my ex-wife, and that person was problematic, right? That person was abusive. That person did this and did that. And this person reminds me of that person, or this person reminds me of my mother or father who engaged in these type of tactics, right? And so when you're able to kind of piece those things together, it's very similar to like going down like you're driving, and let's say that you normally go to your friend's house like a certain direction, but every time you've gone this direction, like something catastrophic has happened or whatever, and so you start going another direction. You notice that road is oftentimes very clear, right? Well, if you keep going down that road and keep on seeing these certain roadblocks or detours or whatever, you're going to eventually start to get familiar. We do this like with everything else in life, but we won't do this when it comes to our emotions, when it comes to relationships, but we can learn from our previous mistakes, from our previous bad partners, we should learn from our previous bad partners and toxic relationships so we don't enter into those relationships again. But a lot of times people won't do that because that means that there's going to have to be some self-reflection. There's going to have to be some self-accountability, some self-responsibility, and that's difficult, but it's necessary to make sure that we don't enter in those situations again. Now, simultaneously, we can also look back at some of our more secure connections as well and say, well, with these people right in my life, I've always felt very open and very honest, and we've always had a good relationship. And where people get conflicted is a lot of times I tell people that relationships are all the same. We put our romantic relationships way up here, and then like all of our other relationships like are just kind of like pedestrians or something like that. But the reality of it is they're all just relationships. And if you start to look at how you've connected with your friends or people who you have like really good relationships with, that you can just be open and honest, and they aren't guilt tripping you and that sort of thing, and you can just talk to them and be very vulnerable with them, and vice versa. You can duplicate that in your romantic relationships, but you're going to have to piece together like what has caused that to be a secure relationship. Like how did you guys meet? You probably didn't. No one does online meeting friends, right? Going back to your point about not online dating, right? No one's swiping right looking for friends, right? Everyone, we meet friends very naturally, and we keep our friends very, for long periods of time typically, right? Not saying that we can't have problematic friends, but if we look at and if we are able to kind of reverse engineer like our successful relationships, we can do the same thing and actually like recreate that same level of success in our romantic ones too.
If a person is afraid of being alone or lonely, that is one way that they are end up finding themselves in relationships that they should not be in. If you lack boundaries or if you have loose boundaries, that's another way, because it's going to be easy to guilt trip you, but you're also still back to people pleasing and things like that, going to prioritize the needs of other people over your own.
Because that person has something you want.
Exactly. If your self-worth is low, if your self-worth is still dependent on external factors or other people, that's another way that you'll find yourself in abusive relationships. Also, if you don't have a strong support system as well. If you don't have a strong support system, like family and friends who can kind of keep you or hold you accountable or can highlight some things that possibly you can't see because you have those rose-colored lenses on, then absolutely that's another way that you can find yourself.
You know what's funny about that? I'm glad you brought that up because we're quick to preach and say, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But then we don't think that, well, if it takes a village to raise a child, then as an adult, we need a village to help support us.
Exactly.
But we're so reluctant to ask for help. We're so reluctant to acknowledge, going back to vulnerability. Right? It's the reason why vulnerability actually is a strength, because you are able to kind of see like who is your true support system when things, and it's one of the things that was one of the quick, I'll say shortcuts, even though it's not a shortcut to a healthy relationship, is I tell people like, the true test of any relationship is not when the relationship is at its peak, when everything is going well. It's when things aren't going so well, when the two aren't getting along. Who is able to be supportive of you, who is there for you, who has your back, who is able to still speak to you respectfully, even though things aren't necessarily going well, even though the two of you aren't getting along. And so when you combine that, like the village and people who are able to still be respectful, even though they're not getting their way, even though you aren't agreeing in that moment, you're probably going to do pretty well.
As human beings, we need community. We need a sense of belonging. We need to feel appreciated, to feel seen. All of those things are important, right? And just like you were saying in regards to romantic relationships and just all interpersonal relationships, if you're only assuming that you can only have those things or have those needs met if you're in a romantic relationship, you are setting yourself up for failure. You need to build a community. If you don't have one, you can create one. And that's another thing. People who do have like family trauma, things like that, they run from that. It's like it's almost like it's a dissonance. Like I want the community, but I'm afraid the community is going to hurt me. So I'm going to run from it. But then you end up running to a person who shows you that they're not secure within themselves. They cannot grant you or give you or create security within a relationship, even though you want that. You see this person can't give it to you, but you tend to still fall in that same position. And just like you said earlier, you can't blame anyone but yourself if you do that.
That person who the way that you described it, who is mistreating you, or they don't have anything to offer you, that sort of thing, it doesn't require for you to change.
Right.
So it doesn't require for you to change. It doesn't require for you to do anything. And so you're going to be more drawn to that person. That's the reason why, you becoming a better version of yourself, and you always having, always being, always be healing, right? Always doing some sort of self-development and self-work and that sort of thing. You're going to naturally start cutting some of those people off. They're going to naturally start falling off because they don't want to do the work. Right. They don't want self-accountability or responsibility. They don't want to make changes. They're not making, New Year's goals and that sort of thing, or maybe they're making them, but they're not doing anything about them. So at the more you begin to work on yourself, you're going to notice that the less that people like that are going to want to stick around.
So there's different cycles. When you're with a person who's abusive, there's different cycles that people go through. And I want to make sure we highlight that, right? You have, and I'll just highlight three. I'll just highlight one main cycle that you see where there's like a tension buildup that starts to happen first. And then you see the explosion, right? You actually see the physical or the outward aggressions that start to happen. And then you see that love and reconciliation, that I'm sorry, it's never going to happen again. I was just upset. I love you so much. Please forgive me. And then it goes back to putting you on your eggshells. And it's this constant cycle that starts to alter the way your brain chemistry is, the way you respond to these situations, the way you think about it, the way you process your emotions. I want to talk about that. If you've noticed cycles when it comes to psychological abuse, I definitely want to talk about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a cycle. You have your idealization phase, the beginning phase where everything is great. The sex is great. Everyone is all lovey-dovey and everything. Then you have your devaluation phase where you start to you start to have conflict, but it's more than just disagreement, right? It's more than just the two of you not getting along. It's more like it's pretty excessive. Just like you, and to your point, you mentioned the word intensity. Like you can know that devaluation phase is coming if
Yes.
the relationship in the beginning is intense.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that when you hit that devaluation phase, right, where they're literally putting you down, right, where you
Yes.
feel like you are beneath them,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because guess what? That first stage, what was it? The idealization. Then,
Mm-hmm.
you know, then into your going back to when you start circling back into that, going into those dynamics, that person, when they start to realize that they are about to lose you, right?
Yes.
Right when you think that you're at your breaking point, right, and they start sucking you back in, that what happens to to your point about the altering the brain chemistry
Mm-hmm.
starts to create a trauma bond,
Yes.
right? One of the things that's not talked about when it comes to the trauma bond is that really one of the pieces of it, one of the essential pieces to it, is you holding on to false hope. You
Mm-hmm.
holding on to false hope that this person has the ability to change, that they have a desire to change, that they want to change,
Mm-hmm.
and so you're going to be more susceptible to them saying, oh, I'll go to therapy, just move back in. I'll do this. Let's just do that.
Yep.
Or oftentimes the thing that you wanted the most, maybe it was kids, maybe it was to get married, maybe it was to buy a house, maybe it was to get a car.
They promise you that.
Or a trip, or they'll take you on a trip, or
Yes.
whatever, all these things. And I call it not true actual change. They're actually intensifying the relationship.
Yes.
What ends up happening is that those things actually cause you to get hooked even more, and to be reliant on that person even more. And it becomes very problematic because every single time, so what happens? Every time there's abuse or recognized abuse or anything like that, what do? You have more kids, you get married, and before you know it, you now have a house, 5 kids, 3 cars. You can't afford any of them, and all these things that you're adding, all these things that you're creating to intensify the relationship is also adding more pressure. And so guess what happens? There's more abuse, because the more pressure that starts to cause, and more friction and more responsibility that you bring into a relationship that already isn't built very well.
Yes.
Right. With no communication, with no, like, this person is going to become more abusive. And they start to realize that it's even less likely for you to leave because of the kids, because of the house, because of all these different things, and because it's more difficult. And then you start to see a lot of that control they start to control the finances, right? And then you start to get to the financial abuse. And and going back to that trauma bond, you have this false perception that this person that this person is on some sort of idealized, right, pedestal, right? You literally think that there's something that you can do to get this person to change, because internally you think that it's your fault. Right. So you think that, okay, well, as long as I keep this person happy, and the only way I can keep this person happy is for me to agree to all of these different things, for this person to have control of the finances, for this person to go through my phone, or for this person to go do this, or this person do that. Before you know it, this person has control over your entire life.
Yes.
And you've literally sacrificed your internal being trying to keep this person happy. And before you know it, you're just a shell of yourself, not walking on eggshells, because your body knows that something's wrong, right? Mentally, something's wrong, but your self-worth is so low that you won't leave, you won't do anything, right? Because you're just a shell of yourself, and you still all of your self-worth is still tied to this person, who internally that something is up.
And I wish more people understood this, because you have families and friends and stuff like that. It's like, well, you should just leave. It's not that easy.
You know what happens when that happens is when I always tell friends and family oftentimes will come to me or DM me. My sister, my mother, my loved one is in a situation like this. Should I tell them? And I tell them, don't tell them, because what happens is that if you tell that person that the person that they're with is controlling and abusive, that person, because they want that person to change so bad, they'll run to their significant other. Guess what? Even my family thinks this. And what happens is that person isolates them even more, because they want more control. They're just trying to break us up. They're just jealous over all the things that I provided for you, and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And they isolate that person even more, so that your loved one is going to end up getting cut off if you keep on
Yes.
encouraging that person to leave. It has to be their decision.
And the sad thing about it is the isolation doesn't even have to look like that necessarily. You can go to a family engagement or something like that, and they can put all kinds of ideas into your family's head to paint you out to be crazy.
Yep.
Or like something's wrong with you. And then now everyone's looking at you like, oh, you're the one that's causing the problem. And now they have the family on their side.
Yep.
You're looking like the crazy one.
Yep.
There are characteristics that you can see in people who are possibly going to be abusive if you enter a relationship with them. And I want to make sure we highlight that, because in the society that we live in, all of these things can be covered up so easily. You can put up a facade all day long. You can pretend to be this great person, but behind closed doors, you're not that person. Right? So I do want to talk about the profile. And I also want to talk about people who are abusive. What does it do for them?
People who are controlling are doing it because sometimes they could just be, that's the reason why I don't really talk about narcissism as much, because it could be a trauma response. It could be locked in a fight response. But people who, going back to your question about the profile, people who lack the ability to be vulnerable. Right. So, so I'm going to kind of talk about both ends of the spectrum, because oftentimes people, when they think of someone who's abusive, they think of someone who's loud and center of attention. And that's the person who gets talked about a lot. And you can kind of see that person coming a mile away, where they feel like they have to be the center of attention. They're very demanding. They're very bullyish, but then the other side isn't talked about as much, where the person is very vulnerable, comes across as very vulnerable, comes across as very meek. But also uses their victimhood as a way and as a means to keep control and that sort of thing. That's the person that isn't talked about enough, and that's the person that you just described that might go to your friends and your family and place seeds of doubt in their head, and you don't even know, like, why is everyone saying that they think I'm crazy? Why does everyone think that I'm depressed and I need to be on medication? This and that, and this person, and you didn't know that this person had been texting your entire family for months. Right, and and that can cause a lot of damage for people. But so it doesn't matter which end of the spectrum that you're talking about. Both of those people are not going to be very, very respectful of your boundaries. Neither one of them. Boundaries to people like this are like they're kryptonite. It's the reason why I tell people and I encourage people to set boundaries very, very early. And to, even if your boundary is, to not talk past 9 on a weekday because you have to be up early for work, you're going to notice such a huge difference. And the bully might say something kind of crazy in the beginning. The person who's a little bit more vulnerable, presents more vulnerable, may not say anything in the beginning, but they'll do a lot more guilt tripping later. So I feel like I'm dating a 15-year-old. Like, I can't believe, well, I would talk to you later, but I guess you can't, you don't talk past 9, like, or one of the other thing that the more vulnerable type would do is create an emergency. An emergency that only you can fix.
Oh, that's so manipulative.
Yep. Well, I tried to call you, I think I have cancer, right? And literally it could be that. Yeah, it could be that. It could be that, especially if it's an ex, especially if it's someone that you're cutting off, they will go to that extent. I've worked with multiple people where there's some, I worked with someone faked a cancer diagnosis for 3 straight years. Of faking car accidents, anything to create a victimhood, because it goes back to fear, obligation, and guilt. You feel like you're obligated, and if you don't take care of them, you're going to feel guilty, right? And so, long story short, one of the biggest thing that you have to pay attention to is that you have to pay attention to how this person is making you feel.
Yes.
Right? Is this person making me feel guilty? Do I feel like this person is demanding of my time and my attention? Pay attention to, I always tell people to pay attention to your 5 areas of boundaries: your mental, your emotional, your physical, financial, and monetary boundaries. And what happens is that you're going to notice that one or all 5 of those areas are going to start to deplete.
Right.
Because you're giving so much time and attention to this person. And even if you try to say, like, hey, listen, I haven't been myself at work. I really gotta, I really need rest tonight or whatever, they're not going to go for it, regardless of which side of that spectrum. So pay attention to those areas, and you'll notice that if those areas start to get depleted, and it's even in, and so I want to be very careful there, because even in a healthy version of love, like you're going to have fun, right? You might stay up a little bit too late or whatever, because it's new love. But, when you try to get things back on track, you're going to notice that person is going to be very resistant to it, and is going to lose it a little
because
bit.
you've conditioned them already.
Yep.
I think a lot of people excuse inexcusable behaviors. Like, for instance, nowadays, being on the phone all night. Oh yeah, we talked about everything. We stayed on the phone all night. And then it starts to become, well, they get upset when I don't call them, or you went out with friends. I got to go take this phone call. I have to call this person. And it's like that jealousy and that possessiveness. People think it's cute nowadays. That's alarming. That should be alarming to you.
You actually should allow I wouldn't intentionally try to make someone upset, but it's okay for people to be upset.
Yes.
Right. And you kind of need to see how this person is going to be when they're upset. One of the things that I hear, especially mostly from women in this one, is they'll see that person go into road rage, and they'll say to themselves, like, well, they were angry with that person. They would never treat me like that. It's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's how they are when they're angry, period.
Yes.
You just haven't seen it towards you yet. And that's something like, weight, it's very common for people to do or treat like wait staff like that and that sort of thing. And people just don't think that they would ever treat them that way, when in reality, you have to understand that when they are upset, this is their demeanor. This is how they are. And it's just a matter of time before that behavior is enacted towards you.
You just see so many people delude themselves from reality, and it's really unhealthy. I definitely appreciate this conversation. And I know there are so many people who needed to just sit right here in front of us and actually listen today. And I'm so glad I got a chance to get to talk to you.
I'm glad to be here. Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad to talk to you as well.
We're going to have more conversations.
Well, we're right up the street. Let's do it.
This is therapeutic. Well, Matt, I appreciate you. Thank you all again for tuning in to Talk to Me, Kittie. We will see you all on the next episode. Bye, babies.